One way to think about our inner world, and especially our inner world in relation to the awakening of consciousness and the expansion of awareness, is to compare it to the universe. For example, we can say by comparison that the ego is akin to the moon. And just as the moon exists inside the orbit of the earth, so the ego exists inside the mind. And it's the stronghold of this sense of me, of identity. It's the lowest, most dense, most contracted form in our inner world. This is the ego. And it's like the moon. And just as the moon has a dark side that's not visible from the earth, so the ego has a shadow side, which is often talked about, for example, in psychosomatic therapy, psychosomatic investigation, where the ego is so deeply rooted in some aspect that is hidden from ordinary consciousness. It has to be dug up, excavated, extracted in some way. Nevertheless, there's the moon and this shadow of the moon, very much like the ego and the shadow aspect of the ego as it's thought about in psychology. And then this ego is encompassed by, surrounded by, exists inside of a higher dimension, which is the mind. The mind is, in this analogy, is akin to the earth. And the earth is an order of magnitude much larger than the moon. It's sort of a tenfold logarithmic expansion of in terms of space and form compared to the moon. But the moon is a dimension that exists inside the dimension of the Earth's orbit, just as the ego exists inside the dimension of the mind's circumference, the mind's orbit. And then in turn, just as the Earth is moving around within the planetary atmosphere of the solar system, so the ego and the mind are existing inside of what spiritual traditions often call our true nature, this more ethereal, more molecular planetary space that surrounds our mind. And when teachings talk about awareness recognizing itself and now recognizing that it can see the mind, it can see the ego inside the mind, it can see all of this inside itself, it means that there's a dimension now beyond the mind, beyond the ego, beyond both, and aware of both and aware of itself being aware of both. This is very much akin to the planetary space in our solar system. And then just as beyond this planetary space, comprising all of it, is the solar system itself, whose source is the sun. And this is very much akin to our true nature, you could say, our pure awareness or simple awareness is encompassed by its source and derives from its source. It is a manifestation of the source, in this case, the sun. And awareness also has at the source of our being something akin to the sun. This is just an analogy, a parallel, of course, but it can be a very helpful way of thinking about it. And with this idea that just as the moon exists inside the dimension of the Earth, inside the Earth's orbit, and the Earth exists inside the higher dimension of planetary space within the solar system, so all of this planetary space in the solar system exists inside the sun's aura, the sun's field of light, and which is a much higher dimension, another logarithmic. We've gone from the moon to the earth to planetary space to the sun. It's a little bit like going from one-fold to tenfold to 100-fold to 1,000-fold in terms of logarithmic scale of expansion. And these worlds exist inside of ourselves. And then just as the sun itself in the solar system exists inside a higher dimension of the galaxy. This points to yet a further expansion of awareness that we can experience. And then just as the galaxy exists inside a much, much farther, vaster dimension of the entire universe, so there is, again, in us, a similar, but on a different scale, but a very similar expansion of awareness. And then beyond that would be considered the absolute void, the infinite void, the height of awareness, which it's difficult to say that word height because that suggests a limit. It would be the infinite, expansive potential of awareness. And this, it can also be looked at in reverse. Consider this ultimate void, this absolute void, contracting. It contracts into the form of the universe, into the body of the universe, and it mistakes itself for that body. It loses its recognition of itself as this absolute source, and then contracts again, and now it's identified with, attached to its manifestation as the galaxy, and again attached to and identified with its manifestation as the solar system, as the planetary space in the solar system, as the Earth, and then the farthest as the moon, and then even the shadow of the moon. And now this absolute awareness has contracted so far, and in doing so has lost more and more of its recognition as awareness. And this is what happens to us with what the fourth way calls identification. Our awareness contracts from higher dimensions into lower dimensions. And the more it contracts, the more it takes on a form and feeling of I, more and more a form and feeling of separateness, singularity, individuality, identity. And then, of course, all the way down to this deeply embedded form of ego, the deep sense of I in each human being. And yet awareness has the capacity to release its attachment with even the deepest, heaviest, most condensed, most contracted form of identity in the ego, including in the shadow of the ego, the shadow of that moon, and expanding and continuing to expand, and as it does, popping out back into higher and higher dimensions of itself, and ultimately returning to its absolute source.